Okay, so we're looking at some biblical concepts with regard to how to manage our minds, how to manage our thinking, so that we can make better decisions in the day to day. And we want to look at just a handful of scriptures today in the course of the time together that we can use to better understand the biblical concepts here and to be able to apply them in our lives in such a way that we can make better decisions in the day to day as we try to manage our lives. So let's turn to Proverbs 4, and we'll read verse 23, which is a foundational verse for us. And this comes across differently in different versions, but essentially it's saying the same thing. So Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart. For everything you do flows from it. So what does that mean, to guard your heart? Well, as you all know, the whole concept of the heart in the scriptures is obviously metaphor, right? We're talking about a metaphorical concept that has to do with your emotion, that has to do with your thinking. It has to do with not the intellect per se, okay? Because the intellect, you're thinking more along the lines of the head, but the heart we typically think about as something more that's an intellectual, that is an emotional seat as compared to an intellectual seat. You hear that even in our own culture in the day to day, where people say, well, do something with we do things with our head rather than our heart, or vice versa, right? Sometimes it's like I've brought up many times before, something like grief. One of the reasons why people are not able to help others to get past their grief is because we live in a culture that emphasizes intellectual arguments as compared to emotional arguments, right? In other words, when someone comes up and they say to you something like, well, you'll get over this, right? That's an intellectual statement. That's not a heart statement. We all know that we're going to get over it. But the point is, we're feeling pain right now, right? It's an emotional thing. It's an emotional reaction that we have. We're not thinking with our heads. We're thinking with our hearts. Same thing with regard to the faith. This is why I have a very strong, have very strong feelings against people who want to bring biblical apologetics into a situation of grief, right? Because a person who's grieving doesn't need to hear that at that moment. They don't need to hear a doctrinal argument. They don't need you to be an apologist for the Almighty in the midst of their pain and suffering, right? Yes, they know that they should have faith. Yes, they know that Yahweh is Elohim, He knows everything, He's sovereign, and all those things. They don't need that to be thrown in their face at that moment, because that's an intellectual argument. That's not an emotional, that's not a heart argument. They're feeling pain, they're in anguish at the moment, and what they need is a listening ear, not someone to add insult to injury by telling them something that they already know intellectually, but at the moment they're not feeling with their heart. So the heart is the biblical description of, it's a metaphorical description of the emotional part of us, the part that makes decisions in the deepest part of us, if you will, right? It's not so much even a head thing. It involves the thoughts, certainly, as we're going to see as we're going through this, but the thoughts are not just intellectual thoughts. That's the point that I'm trying to make to you, okay? When you guard your heart, you have to guard your thinking. You have to guard the way that you process things emotionally, because that's how we wind up getting into trouble. Because if you remember the model that I taught you guys way back when, the CTFAR model, right? Your circumstances will lead to you having thoughts about the circumstances. In other words, a thought is a sentence that you think in your mind about the circumstance. And then a thought is going to lead to a feeling, right? It's a vibration in your body, for lack of a better term, a vibration in your body of how you're going to feel, how you're thinking about that thought, right? In other words, you feel something as a reaction to the thought that you have about a circumstance. And then that feeling that you have is going to lead to a certain type of action or behavior. By the way, another word for feeling is emotion, right? You can use those two interchangeably. So your emotions lead to actions, right? So whatever emotional state, when I say you're going to be in a certain state, whatever state you're in, that's going to lead to, it's going to fuel your actions. That emotional state is going to fuel your actions. So if you're sad, you're going to do sad. If you're angry, you're going to do angry, right? If you're happy, you're going to do happy. So your emotions are going to lead to actions, and then those actions are going to lead to a certain type of result commensurate with that action. So biblically, if you're told in Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Notice that, right? That's a biblical concept. Guard your heart. In other words, watch your heart, watch your emotions, watch the way that you're thinking about things, because everything you do, all your actions, flows from the way that you're thinking, flows from the way that you process those thoughts. So if you're thinking lustfully, right? If you're not guarding your heart and you're thinking lustfully, okay, that lust is that in your heart is going to lead you to do lustful things. If you're thinking from a position of anger, that thinking is going to lead you to do angry things, right? So Cain is told by Yahweh, he says, why is your face fallen? Well, Cain's face is fallen because he's angry, because he's bitter, because he's disappointed. All very disempowering emotions. And Yahweh says to him, if you do what is right, will your face not be lifted up, right? It's kind of interchangeable. If you're doing sad, you're going to be sad. But if you're being sad, you're also going to do sad. They kind of work interchangeably, okay? So he's saying to him, if you do positive things, right? If you do happier things, you're going to have, your face is going to be lifted up. So there's an inherent connection between the emotion and the action, okay? So you have to guard your heart. It's where everything begins. It's in and I'll refer to it as your mind, but please understand that in this case, when I'm saying mind, I'm not talking about the intellect. I'm not talking about the intellectual arguments and the logic. I'm talking about how you think about something from an emotional standpoint, okay? Because it's going to lead you to do things one way or the other. Let's go over to James chapter 1. In the book of James, this is brought out very, very clearly. Starting with verse 2. James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So James says, and I've explained this to you in the past, so I'm going to connect the dots with all these. So James is also saying, consider something. In other words, James is saying, guard your heart. He's saying the same thing that Proverbs says. And he's saying, consider it pure joy. Joy is an emotion, right? Joy is a feeling. He's saying, consider it. It means something, right? What is it? Well, we'll see in a minute. Consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Now, if you just stop reading there, you may get the misimpression that, is there such a word, misimpression? Okay, if not, I just coined it. You get the bad impression, right? How about that? You get the bad impression, if you just stop there, that James is saying to be happy about trials and tribulations, right? Trials of many kinds. That's not what he's saying at all, at all. He's not saying to be happy with trials and tribulations. That would be sadistic, right? He's not saying be happy when you suffer, be happy when you go through things. And there are people out there who misread this, right? And they think that you need to go around smiling all the time, right? You see that sometimes, people who consider themselves religious and Bible believers, and you can't express sadness or whatever because they think it's sinful to do that. And you always got to be walking around with a smile no matter what. And, even if it's a forced smile, right? That's not what this is talking about. It's not talking about going around, disingenuously with a disingenuous smile on your face. People experience pain in life. You experience pain in life. I experience pain in life. You're going to feel it. You're going to express it. Okay. But here's what he's saying. Okay. When he says consider it pure joy, the it is not referring to the trials. You got to keep reading. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds. When you face trials, that's the occasion, right? Is the trials are the incidental part of it. When you face trials, consider it pure joy. Why? Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. The point of the it, the object of the it is not the trial. The object of the it is the perseverance. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So it's not directly the it connected to perseverance, but that's the concept that he's bringing out here, okay? He's saying when you face trials and difficulties in your life, consider that opportunity. That's the it, not the perseverance per se, but consider the opportunity to go through trials and tribulations. Consider that pure joy, because what's giving you pure joy is the perseverance that you're gaining when you get through the trial. In other words, it is giving you a thick skin. It is helping you to mature. The trials themselves stink, right? They're difficult, they're painful, they're challenging. There's nothing happy about a trial, right? But I'll tell you what is happy, what is pure joy. What is pure joy is the ability that you're going to have once you get through that trial, the ability that you're going to have to handle similar trials in the future or other difficult, painful challenges in the future. Why? Because you will have matured. Because Yahweh will have allowed you to use that circumstance, right? The circumstance is never anything. It's how you're thinking about the circumstance. You're going to be able to use that for good, okay? It's a way in which you can turn a bad situation into a good result. And that's what he's talking about here. It's the connection between thinking, feeling, behavior, and results, right? If you consider it joy when you go through these things, that's going to help you to get through those things. In other words, if you begin to change your perspective and you begin to view trials and tribulations not as occasions in which you're going to stumble and you're going to be crushed and your spirit is going to be destroyed forever, if you stop thinking of it in those terms and instead you train your mind, you guard your mind, you guard your heart, right? Instead, if you start using those trials so that whenever any kind of a trial comes upon you, you're able to say, this is an opportunity that I have to learn. This is an opportunity that I have to become mature. This is an opportunity I have to develop a thicker skin. I'm not saying it's easy. The word easy doesn't appear here, right? The word simple doesn't appear here. There's nothing easy about it. Doesn't matter. You're going to go through it anyway. So you either can go through it in a bad attitude like Cain was, right? Or you can go through it in such a way that you say, what can I learn from this situation? Think about it. When you're going through a bad trial, you're going to go through it anyway, whether you want it or not. Life happens, right? Anyone who ever said that a believer, when they become believers, that all of a sudden the trials become minimal or whatever, was just lying to themselves, right? That's not how it works. We all know that life happens. And in point of fact, when you begin to follow Yahweh, a lot of times the pressure intensifies. The very first thing that Yahshua experienced when he was baptized and he came out of the baptismal waters was what? Pure joy? The very first thing that he experienced was that the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness to be tested, right? When Israel left Egypt, okay, and they were baptized through the waters of the Red Sea, the very next thing they experienced was partying and joy all the time, right? No, the very next thing they experienced was hardship in the wilderness, yes? And you can see this in every example in Scripture, that the wilderness experience is part of our journey. It's what makes us, firmer. It's what makes us grow, what makes us mature. There's nothing happy about it. There's nothing joyful about those experiences, and to think otherwise is to deceive yourself and to be disingenuous and, quite frankly, to be hypocritical, right? But the truth of the matter is that's not what James is saying. James is saying, consider it joyful that you have an opportunity to become more mature through that trial. So keep reading here, verse 4, let perseverance finish its work, right? He says, 3, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. That's what you're joyful about, that you're going to be tested anyway. So you might as well do something with that, or your pain is in vain, right? If you allow yourself to be defeated by the challenges and the trials in your life, if you allow yourself to be defeated, okay, by the trials of life, you've wasted an opportunity. Because here's what's happened: you've gone through the trial anyway, or you're going through the trial, yes. So you're experiencing the pain of the trial, but then on top of that, you've allowed the trial to push you on your back and to defeat you. What's the point of that, right? I mean, if we're going to go through something anyway, might as well get something out of it. You ever heard the term, go down swinging? Might as well go down swinging big time, no? From a spiritual standpoint, that's got to be true as well, excuse me. From a spiritual standpoint, we have to learn, my friends, to deal with the trials in our lives in such a way that we learn from them, that we become stronger, that we become more mature. Understand that when we go through those things, those tests of our faith produce perseverance. So much more that I can say here, but when we go to the book of James, I'll talk about that more, because temptation and testing, I think I've explained to you a little bit on the surface that temptation and testing, you know that the New Testament word is the same, right? The same word is used. That's why it can be a little bit confusing when you're reading the English text sometimes, especially here in the book of James. As you look, you say, does it mean testing or does it mean temptation? Well, the answer is both. Because what determines whether it's one or the other is simple. It's your reaction to it. Every test is an opportunity to fall into temptation. And every temptation is a test. But how are you going to react to it? If you are able to deal with it in such a way that you grow and that you learn from it, and you don't fall into the traps, right? And allow it to tear you down, that temptation just becomes another test that you pass. You ever notice that the temptations in your life, I don't want to go too far off track here, but it's important to linger on this point for a second. You ever notice that the temptations in your life, if you know yourself, the temptations in your life are more than likely in line with your personality and with things about you that you need to learn, right? And Yahweh doesn't give you the temptation, right? Because James himself says it. Yahweh doesn't tempt anyone, right? But he does allow testing in his permissive will. And those tests that occur, oftentimes are going to meet with the particular character flaws in us. So if you're the kind of person who is greedy, right? Who wants money and wealth and materialism, I bet you anything that it won't be too long before you have some kind of a temptation in your life where you're being offered the opportunity to cut corners or to gain in a way that's unhealthy, that's unbiblical. If you're a kind of person who's given to sensual lust, it's not going to be long before you run across a person who's going to be ready and willing, or some situation where you're going to be willing to, you're going to be able to fall if you want, if you don't check that, right? If you're a kind of person who is given to, who likes power and influence, believe me when I tell you, you're going to run into situations very quickly where you're going to be offered the opportunity to step out over other people at any cost. And the question is, are you going to jump on that thing, or are you going to resist it? Are you going to learn from it? Or are you going to develop a thicker skin because of it? So think about the kind of things in your life that tempt you, right? Because it's different for all of us. But there's commonality in all of it for all of us. And that commonality is that whatever those temptations are, they intensify something within our characters, right? So you have to think long and hard about those things so that you can decide if it's something that's going to become a temptation to you and a snare, or if it's something that's going to become a test that you overcome and stretches you and makes you better for it and better able to handle a similar temptation as you move forward. Because what it says in verse 4, verse 3 says, the testing of your faith produces perseverance. What's perseverance? Perseverance means that you're able to hang in there, right? And every time you pass that test, in whatever form it comes, you become that much more able to handle that particular issue. And you last longer and longer. You almost develop a tolerance for it, right? Not a tolerance in the bad sense, but you develop a tolerance in the sense that you're not overcome by the thing. It's almost like your body developing an immunity to it. That's the sense in which I mean that you develop a tolerance to it. And then in verse 4, let perseverance, and here's very important, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, right? That's the whole point of it, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. In other words, the term mature and complete implies what Yahweh wants to accomplish with us. James uses the word teleos, which means complete, right? He wants us to be a whole, complete person, a person of integrity. And the way that we become people of integrity is because we develop maturity. And that perseverance, the perseverance of those trials and tests, when they finish their work, they produce maturity in us and they make us complete so that we don't lack in anything. You look at yourself now and you consider what you were like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and if you've done things right and you've lived life and you've overcome temptations and trials and challenges, you know that you're probably a much stronger person now than you were back then. If you're not, then it's because you have been failing in letting this come to its conclusion. Notice what James says. What our tendency is when trials and problems and suffering and persecution come, what do we want to do? We want to get rid of it very quickly. We want to medicate it right away, right? Wrong way to deal with it. This is why we fall into temptations. This is why we become, we develop compulsions. And in the most cases, in most extremes, we develop addictions. Why? Because of failure to deal with those issues themselves. We try to medicate those things. We try to get rid of them. We try to stop them. We try to get out of the suffering as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. And by the way, I promise you, I'm not wagging a finger at you, preaching at you. I promise you this applies to all of us, right? This is what we do as human beings. We want to end the pain quickly. We want to get that pill so that we can feel better right away. We want someone to fix it for us, right? Because we don't want to go through the pain. James says it's a bad idea. Says that's the wrong way to deal with it. He says what you want to do is you want to let that trial go to its natural conclusion, not so that you fall to the temptation, but in other words, that you endure it and deal with it through its natural, that you face it head on, right? So that by the time that you get through it, you are now mature. Because if you try to cut it off early, yeah, you'll stop the pain for a little bit, but you know what? You're going to be right back at it next time. And guess what? Next time is probably going to be worse. Why? Because you've never learned to deal with it. You've never learned to deal with that challenge. You've never learned to deal with that frustration. You've never learned to control your anger. You've never learned to control your lust. You've never learned to control your desire for power. You've never learned to control your desire for money. So the next time it happens, you're gonna fall, and maybe even worse, because you've never learned to deal with it, because you've never let the trial go to its final conclusion. So James says to do a very hard thing. He says, get through the trial. Let yourself go through it. Consider it joy that you're going through it, because it's teaching you something. Instead of looking at it as, here I go again, here's another opportunity to fail, say to yourself, this is another opportunity that Yahweh is giving me to show my mettle and to show that I can get through this and to deal with it, to confront it head on. Instead of reaching for that candy bar, you confront the emotion, whatever that emotion may be. Remember we went through the exercise of the values clarification during the Feast of Tabernacles, and we went through not only the positive things, but we also went through the negative emotions. Remember that? Okay. What do you think you're supposed to do with those negative emotions? You got to look at those, because those are the things that speak to you, that drag you down in life. Maybe for you, it's inferiority, right? Because remember, the temptations that we go through, they speak to an element of our character that we need to deal with, right? The temptation stuff is the stuff on the surface. It's the way it manifests in our lives. It's the way that we act out. It's not the temptation itself doesn't define us, you understand? We allow it to define us because we let it tear us down. But what's really behind it all is what we're thinking, because we're not guarding our minds. We're not guarding our hearts. We're not guarding our thoughts. We're not watching. We're not observing, right? So someone who is involved in lustful behavior, for example, right? Maybe it's a person who is surfing internet porn, right? What is this person? Is the problem with that person the sexual problem? Not really. Not from all the stuff that I've read. The person is having a difficulty with a deeper issue, a core issue. It may be inferiority. It may be shame. It may be feeling disrespected all the time. Whatever it may be, it's a core issue. Or if you're a person who's dealing always with anger, right? There are people out there with this angry people, right? Is it just the anger? The anger is the way in which it manifests itself. What are they angry about? Always go deeper, go levels deeper, right? What are they angry about? Maybe they feel that they're always being stepped on. Maybe they feel insignificant. Maybe they value significance at a very high level, and they always feel that everything in life that they're being looked down upon. That's a problem. So the way that they react to it is not by becoming inward and becoming introverted and sad, which is how other people deal with it, but in their case, they deal with it with anger and acting out and snapping and sarcasm and whatever else, right? This is all very human stuff, right? So it manifests itself, and it sees its expression in the acting out and the temptations, but that's not where it begins. So what happens is when it comes to those, when you experience those challenges, you got to go deeper and confront face to face the emotion, the guarding of the heart. You're watching what's coming out of your heart. Face it, right? Is the core issue fear? Face the fear, right? Face the fear. That's what you're called to do. If you're only dealing with the outward expression of that fear, then you're only dealing with the symptom. You're not dealing with the core issue. The core issue is the fear or the inferiority or the shame, right? But we don't like to look at those things because they're painful, too painful. Believe it or not, it's less painful for us to deal with the effects of a compulsion or an addiction than it is to deal with the core issue itself. Because the core issue, to try to deal with it, is like dealing with death itself. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I promise you that I'm not. That's the real problem. Someone who is overweight, right? Who they're just way overweight. Their problem is not that they like food. I promise you that. Okay? They like food because it comforts them. Because it comforts them. What do I mean by comfort? It comforts them from having to deal with the underlying issue, whether it was rejection that they experienced over and over again as children, or inferiority, or whatever it may be, shame, some deep-seated shame. Maybe there was sexual abuse when they were younger and they feel shame from that they never resolved. And the way that they deal with it is not by dealing with it, with the shame, but by comforting themselves and eating, right? Insert your name or my name in the line of whatever it may be. We all have something that we're dealing with. The question is, are we dealing with it? Are we considering it at its core? So James says, let yourself go through the trial. Don't try to cut it short. Don't try to take that pill. Don't try to have someone fix it. Because if you do, you're going to fix the outside, but you're not going to fix the inside, right? If you let it go to its natural conclusion and you face the thing head on, you're eventually going to get to the point where you could deal with the issue, and then it becomes easier next time, right? Not easy, but it becomes easier. Why? Because you've developed a thicker skin, because you've actually confronted the issue itself, right? So a lot going on here in James, and that's just kind of cutting the surface. But I want to move on. Now, let's go over to Mark 8 for a minute here. Been doing a lot of study in the book of Mark. I actually just finished the book of Mark after about a 2-month-long study. Great book, great book. Can't wait to teach it to you. Mark 8, verse 34. So Yahshua's saying, we've all heard this before, right? But we've never really thought of it, I don't think, in terms having to do with our thinking, right? Mark 8:34, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. So there have been all kinds of explanations over the years about this whole concept of denying yourself, right? And some people think that this is referring to some kind of an aesthetic, right? Where you become a monk and you go and you deny yourself worldly pleasures, and you don't eat, and you don't drink, and you don't smoke, and you don't play games or whatever, or if you go off into a cloister somewhere. I think that that's all wrong. I think it's a total misrepresentation of this passage here. We can debate that someday if you feel that those are some of the things that have to do here. I don't think it's talking about that at all. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. Okay, so that has something to do with denying yourself. And it says, and take up their cross. What was the cross? So some people think there's another interpretation that says you take up your cross, it means you take up your burden, right? And by the way, just to reiterate, and I have to keep reiterating this until we really get it to our heads, I use the word cross anymore because that's what it was. It was a cross. Now, people want to have theological debates over that, fine. But the instrument that the process was called crucifixion, so let's stop redefining words, right? It was a crucifixion. That's a legitimate historical term. The Romans crucified people, okay? Now, we can debate what cross means because everybody assumes that it means that, this thing with 2 pieces of cross timber. I don't believe that that's necessarily the case. I believe that he could very likely have been crucified on an upright stake by itself, right? But it's also possible that he was crucified with a T-shaped cross, okay? There's also some evidence of that. But, let's assume for the moment, I still come down the side that he would have been crucified on an upright stake, okay? But nevertheless, the term cross is still an accurate term because it doesn't imply necessarily, people want to insist that it implies that you had these cross timbers. I don't believe that at all. So let's just do away with the redefining of terminology, and we're going to call it a cross, and we're going to call the process crucifixion, okay? So people will say, there's one argument out there that says cross, to take up your cross means you take up your burden. We all have burdens in life and challenges, and you have to deny yourself and take up your burden, get up every morning and fulfill your responsibilities, and you just got to kind of grin and bear it and do it, right? It's a nice interpretation, but I don't believe it's supported by the text. Why? Because it denies the meaning of the words. What is a cross? A cross is an instrument of death. The cross is not some burden that you carry. The cross was an instrument of death. To take up the cross means something. It's something very specific. It's metaphorical. It means, because remember, we're talking about the self. So you're denying yourself and taking up your cross. In other words, it means to put to death the self and its desires. Okay. In other words, anything that's causing you to choose something else over Yahweh, you have to put that desire to death, because you got to deny yourself and follow him. In other words, you got to seek Yahweh's ways. You got to seek following Yahshua's footsteps. In other words, you have to do what? You have to change your thinking, okay? The thinking which right now in each and every one of us is directed to self. We do everything now only for self. Okay, yeah, we'll do something for someone else every now, but ultimately, even when you do something for someone else, you got to examine your motives sometimes, right? Because sometimes you do it not purely for the sake of doing it for the other person, but how you're going to feel on the basis of doing something for the other person. How people will look at you. Let's be honest. How people will look at you for having done something for them. How people will thank you for having done something for them. This is one of the reasons why we get upset sometimes when we're giving to people and giving, and they don't give in return. Have you ever felt like that? I have. You feel like you're giving, and it's not being reciprocated, because that's the mentality we have. Our unintentional thinking, in other words, when I say unintentional, I mean our default thinking. Our default thinking is, hey, what's in it for me ultimately? Our default thinking is, I'm going to do for someone, but it's conditional. You don't say that because it's not polite to say that, but that's what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm going to do for someone, but I'm not going to keep doing for them, because if I keep doing it, I don't get anything back, then therefore, what am I doing this for? But when you look at that, think about how really self-desired that is, right? How self-centered that is. If we're doing for someone truly sacrificially, you're doing it without expecting anything in return. You're doing it sacrificially, like Yahshua did it, right? And that's not how we normally think. That's an intentional way that we have to do. We have to intentionally direct our thoughts towards Yahweh. We have to intentionally think in ways that are pleasing to Yahweh, because it doesn't come easily to us, right? Because we're naturally self-centered. We naturally do things for our own edification. So the whole thing that Yahshua is trying to say here is that if we change our thinking to think more like Yahweh's thoughts, as opposed to just thinking our own thoughts, then we're going to achieve very different results in our lives. It's like what we see in Isaiah 54. So hold your place there in Mark 8 for just a moment, and go with me to Isaiah 54. Isaiah 54, beginning with verse 8. And this is a fundamental problem for all of us, right? For all of mankind. 54:8. In a surge of anger, I hid my face from you. Am I in the right place here? Maybe I got the wrong verse. Give me a minute here. Let's make sure. I don't think it's 54. I think I wrote that down wrong. Give me a minute. I'm sorry, 55. Let me change that on my notes so I don't mess that up in the future. 55 verse 8. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares Yahweh. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. You know, we don't necessarily think the way Yahweh thinks. Yahweh has a very lofty way of thinking, and oftentimes we don't have even the remotest thought that is his thought, because we're always thinking about how we can achieve things for ourselves and how we can do things only for ourselves. And I know that sounds very broad brush, but I really believe it's true. I think that for the most part, there's nothing wrong with doing something for self-interest, right? We do that every day. But when that is our only exclusive goal, is to do things for self-interest, then we're not thinking Yahweh's thoughts, because Yahweh's thoughts are more thinking about the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. In other words, it's not just about us. Everything's not about us, my friends. And we want to think everything is about us. And if we're going to change that, we have to learn how to change that unintentional default thinking, right? Which is just self-directed, and you have to be able to take up your cross and follow him. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. That's tough to think about. I don't know if I'm there. Are you there? Are you willing to lose your life for the sake of the gospel? Are you willing to lose your life for the sake of this message? Or will we find ourselves in a position where we're willing to deny? Now, that sounds like fantasy land, right? That sounds like fantasy land, like just a point for theological discussion until you put it in the real world, right? Let's not even go to the point of death. Let's look at modern day examples, right? When you're talking with people at work or with your friends, right? Are you willing to take a stand for the faith? I don't mean to be abrasive with people. You know better than that. But when the world is constantly telling you this is the way it is, and this is the way it is, this is the way it is, and you're a fanatic for thinking this, do you just, give into that and say, well, yeah, I guess that's true, and all of a sudden you become very mealy-mouthed about your faith? If that's you need to reconsider that, right? If we're not willing to stick up for what we believe, what is it? Is this just an intellectual exercise for us? I'm not trying to promote did we lose it? It says your internet connection is unstable. You still hear me? Okay. I'm not trying to promote an us versus them mentality, right? Nothing can be further from the truth. But I am saying that there are biblical principles and standards that we should not be willing to discard just because we want to fit in, right? So that's another aspect to this. The aspect is, are we willing to give all for him? Or are we willing to lose our life for him and for the gospel? Or are we willing to just do something that's going to save our own neck, right? What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Are we ashamed of what we believe in? We demonstrate our shame in what we believe in when we're not willing to take a stand for biblical truth. Now, biblical truth, you got to be careful about how you present that, right? Because biblical truth doesn't mean that you get dogmatic about everything. But there are certain things in this world that the Bible says is this way and the world says is not that way. And we have to take a stand on those particular things. Are we willing to do that? So this whole concept of denying yourself, taking up your cross and following him means that you're thinking differently. You're thinking different thoughts. You're changing from that default thinking that's all directed towards the self and directing that instead towards ways that would be honoring and pleasing to Yahweh. What about 2 Corinthians 10? Couple more verses I want to share with you. 2 Corinthians 10. This is a very, very important verse that you should all star or underline or highlight or something. And you can maybe put Proverbs 4:23 right next to it because it goes right along with it. 2 Corinthians 10, beginning with verse 4. The Apostle Paul speaking to the congregation of Corinth, and he says, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have eternal power to demolish strongholds. What has power to demolish strongholds? The weapons that we fight with, right? What are those weapons? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of Yahweh. What is a pretension? A pretension is every pretension is like a lofty thing that pretends to be it, pretends to be the truth, and it's not. It's a pretender, right? So, and we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of Yahweh, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Messiah, and we will be ready to punish every act which comes from what? The feelings that come from what? The thoughts, right? We'll be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. So in other words, he's saying that we don't, he compares to what we're doing to being in a battle, right? But we're not a battle. Well, verse 3 for context. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does, right? We're not soldiers in a physical fight, but we are soldiers in a sense in a spiritual fight, right? Except our weapons are not, guns and knives and swords and the like, right? Our weapons are spiritual weapons. Our weapons are weapons that are fought in the mind. We demolish arguments and every pretension. Some versions say every imagination, right? Your version may say imagination, right? every imagination, every thought that sets itself up against knowledge of Yahweh. There are many thoughts that come to our minds that are not kosher thoughts, right? That are not thoughts that we should be having. There are thoughts that are in opposition to Yahweh. What do we do with those thoughts? Do we continue to entertain them? Do we make them parts of our lives and then act upon those things? Because that's the next thing, right? Those thoughts are going to lead you to feel a certain way. And then that feeling, that emotion is going to be the fuel that drives the action. And in this case, we're talking about actions of disobedience that are fueled from wrong thinking, right? So our job is to wage war. It's the same thing as, it's a little bit more, it's an offense as compared to the defense of Proverbs 4:23, right? Proverbs 4:23 says to guard your minds, right? To guard your hearts. Here we're talking about going on the offense, combating, waging war, doing combat against those thoughts and capturing them so that we can put them out of commission, right? But what we do as human beings is we all too often, we indulge in those thoughts, right? We have indulgent thinking, whether it's self-pity or lust or anger or bitterness, or it manifests itself in any number of ways. And when we indulge in those are thoughts that are pretentious in the sense that they pretend to give you what you really truly need in your life, but they're not. What you really truly need in your life is to think like Yahweh, is to think thoughts of peace, to think thoughts of joy, to think thoughts of, right? What is it you see over in Philippians? Just hold your place there in 2 Corinthians. Let's see now. Okay, what I'm looking for, Pam, you're usually my walking concordance. So, think on these things. That's whatever is pure, or whatever is. I love you. Okay, 4. Right, 8. Right, you're to chapter and verse. All right. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right. Right. These are the thoughts, the things you need to think. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, what do? Think about such things. Notice the follow-up, verse 9. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, action. Thought, action. And the Elohim of peace will be with you, right? So you're thinking these things. These are the things that you need to fill your mind with. Let me tell you, whenever I begin a morning, checking my Twitter feed, my day is gone for the rest of the day. I'm done. I've proven that to myself over and over again, but like a fool, I go back and do it again, thinking that somehow the next day's Twitter feed is going to have different results for me. I promise you that it doesn't. So as soon as I start going on there and I start seeing what this so-and-so said to so-and-so, and what this person is doing to that person, and what this country is doing to this country, and what this, my thinking is already oriented towards whatever's not noble, whatever the opposite of noble is. Ignoble, right? So whatever is not pure, whatever is impure, right? Whatever is, what are the other verses there? Whatever is, say again? Whatever is not lovely, right? Whatever is not right, whatever is not admirable. My thoughts start to dwell on those things. I almost can't help it, right? I can, but I don't do it because my mind is already so trained to be negative that I see those things and immediately my attitude and my demeanor begin to change. And already my day begins to be set. So you know what? I try not to do that because I know that as soon as I start to do that, I know it's going to change it's hard. It's a bit of a dilemma because I want to be informed, right? I don't have trash in my Twitter feed. That's the stuff that I've weeded out, right? I promise you, I'm not sifting through People magazine on my Twitter feed and through National Enquirer and all kinds of trash, right? I'm talking about, notable news things, and I don't do local news ever. Because it's except for the weather maybe, and even that you got to be careful sometimes, right? But because it's always partly cloudy, it's never partly sunny. If it's partly cloudy, by definition, it's also partly sunny, right? But that's a discussion for another day. But I'm talking about things that are good under good circumstances, right? News or whatever, right? Maybe good. but it's not, because they're the way that they sell stuff, the way that they gain advertisers, the way that they get ratings is by promoting all kinds of negative, controversial things, right? So it's a challenge in this world to stay informed while at the same time trying to stay away from all that negativity. It's almost impossible, but you got to do it. You got to try as hard as you can and think on these other things. Because do you know that it's impossible to be grateful for something and be angry at something at the same time? Try it sometime. Try to devote yourself to 10, 15 minutes of just gratitude. And while you're thinking about gratitude and all the things that you're grateful for, try to be angry at the same time. I promise you that you can't do it. But we choose the other route because it's already unintentional, right? It's our default setting. We have to work on that so that we can grab those thoughts and take them captive. Do we realize that we have the power to do that? That's the greatest news in the world, that we have the power, we have the ability. In fact, according to the scriptures and the verses that we're reading, we have the obligation to do that, right? We have the responsibility to grab those negative thoughts and to turn it around, to stop thinking by default on impure, ignoble, not correct, not admirable, etc. things, and instead to replace them with all the things that are going to help us to be better people and think differently. I don't mean to walk around like a fool with a smile on your face all the time, disingenuous, acting like there's nothing wrong in the world, right? Again, I said to you many times before, you don't go out into the backyard and say there are no weeds. There are plenty of weeds, we know that. But do we have to remind ourselves of it every single moment? Do we have to see them in living color and describe them in living color? Do we have to, it's like, Chuck Swindoll makes me laugh. He talks about conversations that he's seen with older people, like, retired people sitting in a cafe, in a diner or something. And, they're talking about their latest physical ailments and all the, creaks and moans and bodily discharges and all kinds of things. Who wants to hear that? Who wants to even aspire to go to retirement in old age? And, if that's all you have to look forward to. Not me. I want to be moving, from here until the moment that I drop, right? Like Chuck says, I want to be preaching in the middle of a sermon and my chin hit the pulpit, right? Well, instead of going on and just thinking about all the worst and all the negative things in life. And you know who has the power over that? You do. I do. We have the power over that. Yahweh has given us the ability to think, to choose our thoughts. But we allow ourselves to go along with this society that is obsessed with thinking all kinds of things by default that have nothing to do with the word of Yahweh, or that are just self-directed, or that are just negative all the time. And we have the power and the ability and the responsibility as believers in Yahweh to turn that around, to change our thinking, to transform our thinking. That's what that Romans 12 tells us, right? That we have to not be conformed to this world, but we have to be transformed by the renewing of what? Our mind. Romans 12. Let's look at that. You can see it in print in front of you. Therefore, I urge you, means there's an urgency. I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of Yahweh's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to Yahweh. This is your true and proper worship. And how do you do this? Do not conform. What does it mean to be conformed? To conform means to shape yourself to that thing. Do not conform to the pattern of this world. What is the pattern of this world? The pattern of this world is to think of self. The pattern of this world is to think negatively all the time, to think the worst in people before the best in people, to think I'm going to get them before they get me. I'm going to be, revenge is talked about in this chapter because of that. All the human nature things are described in this chapter because it's human nature. The pattern of this world says I'm going to get them before they get me. The pattern of this world is to think I'm going to get mine over and above the other. I don't care whether they get it or not. I'm going to get mine. The pattern of this world is to think, well, life, that's just what life is like. We live, we die, and everything between is just, one downhill thing after another, a whole negativity all the time, right? That's the pattern of this world. The pattern of this world is because we live in an evolution, in a race that evolved. Then there's no man or woman better than the other, and therefore everybody I can do whatever I want whenever I want, and It's survival of the fittest. That's the pattern of this world. The pattern of this world is, understanding we're talking about a mindset, not about individual people who think differently, right? The pattern of this world is to think that mankind is the best that there is, or all that there is, and that Yahweh is not in the picture, right? The pattern of this world is much different. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Your mind has to be renewed. Then you will be able to test and approve what Yahweh's will is. In other words, you have to test things, right? Test it for what? To see if they live up to the standards of Yahweh's word. Do they match with his standards? Do they match with his way of life, his thinking, like Isaiah 55 says? And approve what Yahweh's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Do we do that? Do we do that? The last thing that I want to describe, and then we'll bring it to a close, is Mark 8. And we'll read verses 14. I'm just giving you a little taste of Mark today. Mark 8:14. The disciples have forgotten to bring bread. You all remember this. We're coming up to Passover time pretty soon. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Yahshua warned them. Watch out for the yeast, the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Of course, he wasn't speaking about bread at all, right? Aware of their discussion, Yahshua asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. He answered to them, do you still not understand? What was happening here? Nothing mystical going on here. And we don't have to read anything into the numbers 12 and 7 and everything else, right? The point is that they were picking up, that they had leftovers, right? They started out with not even believing that they had enough to feed everybody. And they didn't, right? But here's the thing, is that their default thinking was, this can't be done. This can't be done. And Yahshua was saying to them, get past your limited thinking. Yes, you're right. You can't do it, but who's asking you to feed them? You're not doing it of your own volition. I'm asking you to feed them. I'm an emissary from Yahweh. I feed these people. I'm the good shepherd. All you got to do is bring me what you have, right? If you give me what you got, I'll take care of the rest. But they couldn't see that because they were limited in their thinking. Those limiting beliefs that said we can only know what's happening in the sight of our eyes, right? And this is only one instance. There are many instances. Before the study started, I was having a discussion with the folks here. We were talking about the disciples and how disciples went through an evolution in their lives, how they went through an evolution of thinking. Throughout the book of Mark, you see Yahshua repeatedly rebuking them for being thick-headed and just not seeing, not getting things. Remember, this is the originator of the word, right? He is the word in flesh, the one whose word was spoken, and right, it's him. You want an interpretation of something, you go to the source, right? He was the source. They had the source living and walking among them, teaching them, and they still weren't getting it. What was happening to them? Were they bad people? They weren't bad people. It's like us. We don't get things, right? Sometimes we're not bad people. It's that we have old paradigms, yes? We try to fit new teachings into old ways of thinking. Just a few chapters before, he says to them, you can't put new wine into old wineskins, right? Because if you put the new wine into an old wineskin, the wineskin is brittle. It's old and it's brittle and it can't stretch and it'll burst, right? You can't take a piece of new cloth and sew it onto an old garment and it not be torn when it expands, right? That's naturally is going to happen, and the garment will tear, because in both cases, you're trying to take something new. The teaching, it's what he's saying. You're trying to take my teachings and you're trying to squeeze them into something that's not meant to be limited by. And the context in which he's saying that is these problems that they're having with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who had their teachings were old and stale and siloed thinking, right? Just like with us, my friends, we can't have, legalistic ways of thinking where we're trying to squeeze people like with a shoehorn into our way of thinking and having us versus them type mentality. It doesn't work that way, right? You have to meet people where they live. I don't mean that you compromise your faith and your beliefs, because that's wrong also, right? Either extreme is wrong. You don't compromise your beliefs to accommodate people, but you have to meet people where they live and try to help them to understand. The Apostle Paul did that all the time. He went to Athens and he saw a whole row of idols. He didn't go and embrace idolatry and say, oh, it's okay, the idols are fine, no problem. It says that his spirit was vexed, right? Our spirits too get vexed, right? There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with taking a stand for your faith. That's why I say you have to take a stand for your faith. But he was vexed, but what did he do? Did he walk and say, oh, these bunch of pagans, I'm in the wrong place, and just throw them, leave them to their idolatry and let's go on and move on to greener pastures? No, he stayed. And he used that he met them where they lived. And he used that idolatry to try to teach them, if you could imagine that. He stood there on Mars Hill, right? That's what they called it, the Areopagus, Mars Hill, in the midst of a group of essentially hostile people, total strangers, many of whom were mocking him because they were saying that he was, teaching all these strange things because he was teaching about the resurrection. But notice, he spoke his piece. He didn't even appeal, at least the written record shows us that he didn't even appeal to a word of scripture. Why? Because they didn't know scripture. They didn't know what he was talking about. He used their own writings, right? He quotes something from one of their poets. He speaks to them in a language, he takes the concept, the biblical concept, and he translates that into a way in which they can understand. He met them where he lived because he loved them and he wanted them to come to salvation. He's trying to take new teachings, and he's not trying to constrain it by the old, who would have said, these Gentiles, they can never be taught. They're just a bunch of dogs. You're wasting your time with them. Paul wasn't thinking that way. He had new thinking. He had expanded his thinking. And he said, it's going to be a tough sell. And as soon as he walked into the city, he saw it because he saw the rows of idols there. And he goes to them and he says, by the grace of Yahweh and the innovation and ingenuity that Yahweh's moved upon his heart. And he says, you see, you have this one idol that says to the unknown mighty one. That's the one that I proclaim to you, right? He met them where they lived, and new wineskins, right? And the apostles were going through the same thing, limiting beliefs. The disciples in leaven, the leaven was the limiting beliefs in them, right? They couldn't shake them off. They couldn't shake off the dulling, D-U-L-L-I-N-G, the dulling influence of old paradigms. And Yahshua was trying to teach them, if you're going to be my disciple, you need to learn to think differently. You need to learn to transform your mind and not conform to the patterns of the world, whether they're patterns of paganism or they're patterns of stale, legalistic religion. It doesn't fit. Or politics, right? It's interesting. The context is the Herodians. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Who are the Pharisees and the Herodians? The Herodians we don't know a whole lot about, but we know that they're attached to Herod somehow. Who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the ruling class of the religious establishment, right? Old religious paradigms. Who are the Herodians? The Herodians were tied to Herod. Maybe they were officials in his court. Maybe they were staff members of Herod. But the point, I believe, of those two things is you have religion on the one hand and you have government on the other hand. Old religious ideas and old ideas about politics. And throughout the rest of the book of Mark, he's he's taking their old paradigms, turning them upside down, upside their heads. You think a king is the one who's going to come here conquering and ready to destroy. But I tell you, I'm going to come in here riding on a donkey of peace in accordance with Zechariah. And they're wondering, when is this king coming? When is this king coming? Is you going to do it now? You're going to do it now? You're going to finally put the Romans in their place? And he comes in on a donkey, on a bunch of palm fronds. How different is that? And then the other two come and they say, Joshua, I want you to do something for us. What do you want me to do for you? I want you to put one of us in your right hand when you come to your kingdom, one in your left hand. In other words, we're going to be your bodyguards when you come to the kingdom. Woo! The big men. And he says to them, can you go through what I'm about to go through? Can you suffer the fate that I'm going to go through right now? He said, yeah, sure, we could do it. Sure, we could do it. Because you know what? You will. But it's not up to me to put one on the right, one on the left. That's for who Yahweh has reserved it. And then he goes on to teach them about the one who wants to serve, but who wants to lead has to be the one who serves first. You've heard that a king is one who leads and directs and bosses people around and influences and tells people what to do. And I'm telling you that you got to be like a little child, right? Who trusts me above anything and who doesn't lord it over people, but does things with meekness and humility, you see. That's what a king does, right? A king serves. A king doesn't take and lord it over everybody. A king serves. That is his power. That is his strength. Old paradigms, upside down their heads. Old ways of thinking, limiting beliefs, leavening out the new in. Transformation, transforming of the mind, right? He says, seek first the kingdom and the fundamental provisions will be provided, right? According to Matthew 6. And there's much more that I could say about that. Let me just look something up very quickly, if you just bear with me. I can find it quickly. If not, then we'll just conclude here. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to read you this, and then we'll conclude with this. Okay, so this is from Chuck Swindoll's commentary on the book of Mark. I like this. He's referring to verses 17 to 21, which we did not read, I don't think. Yeah, we read that. We read part of that. Okay. So he says, this became, and I'm going to read directly from the book, says, this became another quote unquote facepalm moment for Yahshua. You know what facepalm moment, right? He asked, do you not yet see or understand? The Greek word translated see, noeo, means to perceive by the mind, to apprehend, or to observe with reflection or comprehension. The term for understand, siniemi, has the literal sense of bringing separated things together. Metaphorically, it denotes the process of assembling data or clues to arrive at a reasonable conclusion. I would paraphrase Yahshua this way. Don't you get it? Can't you connect the dots? The clues make the conclusion self-evident. How can you fail to see it? Yahshua then reviewed their experiences, walking them through the evidence while highlighting important facts. So here are the experiences. You have a little chart here. Experience. Yahshua cared about the needs of the 5,000 in the Galilean wilderness, right? How many basketfuls did you pick up? 12. How many basketfuls in this case? 7. Facts. So the experience, Yahshua cared about the needs of the 5,000 in the Galilean wilderness. Facts. Yahshua multiplied insufficient supplies. He multiplied insufficient supplies to provide for his people in abundance. Experience. Yahshua cared about the needs of the 4,000 in the wilderness of the Decapolis. And the facts, Yahshua multiplied insufficient supplies to provide for his people in abundance. By the way, it's interesting that in the first case, 5,000 in the Galilean wilderness, these were clearly Jews in the Galilean wilderness. The Decapolis was the second situation where he did the 4,000. Sometimes people think that those are the same instance and that somehow they just copied this wrong. No, twice. No, it's two separate instances, two completely different geographic regions. What do I believe is happening there? Jewish, Gentile. The Galilean wilderness, Decapolis, which was 10 cities around the Jordan area that were more concentrated with Gentiles. Okay, the pattern had been established, but in both situations, he multiplied insufficient supplies to provide for his people in abundance. Then he continues, the pattern had been established. Logic demanded that the disciples consider the present situation. Yahshua cared about their needs. They held a loaf of bread in their hands. The man responsible for those 2 earlier miracles sat in the boat with them. So, let me be clear, the disciples were not stupid. They struggled to overcome 2 difficulties that plague us to this day. The first is the dulling influence of old paradigms. There it is. Like wagon wheels in a rut, we follow the patterns of thinking traced across the spiritual landscape by previous generations. The world system would have us think that if we don't provide for ourselves, we will not eat. Yahshua called 12 men to blaze a new trail of grace so that succeeding generations would learn the foundational principle of the new kingdom. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these fundamental provisions will be added to you. At times, the disciples also struggle with what I call the hothouse syndrome. They had been around the miracle worker for many months. The supernatural had become second nature. Yahshua gave sight to the blind. He restored withered hands, cleansed hopeless lepers, opened deaf ears, and loosened mute tongues. By the way, this is the same thing that happened to Israel in the wilderness. We're also critical. Oh, they saw all these miracles, and then they were, it's so easy in the hindsight of history, right? It's always so easy to go back and point fingers and say, wow, if we saw all that, we would never have, people get so emboldened sitting in the sidelines, right? Not being in the arena. Yeah, they sold. Has it ever occurred to those people that maybe the very reason why they became rebellious in the wilderness was because they saw those miracles? Because it become so commonplace. That's why miracles are rarely done, right? That's why Yahshua refused to put on a show. Because if you put on a show for people, then the attraction becomes the show, not the core of what's happening behind the scenes. He wasn't going to put on a show for anyone. He did miracles on rare occasions because that's what made them miracles. People use the term miracle, and I said, I experienced this miracle and that miracle. Baloney. You experienced nothing. Miracles that Yahshua did were instantaneous. They were huge, and they were instantaneous, and they usually defied nature, and they were unmistakable, right? But they were rare. That's why they were miracles. And the reason that he didn't do them more often was because of this, because it could become commonplace in the minds of people. So the supernatural had become second nature. Yahshua gave sight to the blind. He restored withered hands, etc. He cast out demons, changed the weather, and raised the dead. The 12 witnessed his power, so often they began to regard his miracles as commonplace. We face this danger as well. We can be around spiritual things and scriptural teaching and Bible studies and verse memorization so long and so often that the revolutionary message of the gospel can become ho-hum. Like the disciples, we can forget that the mission and vision of Messiah apply to us, right? So much more that we can say about that. But the bottom line is old paradigms, right? Old ways of thinking, they become stale in their thinking and dull in their thinking. And Yahshua had to turn that around. And many of the teachings that you see described in the book of Mark are designed to do precisely that, to show them the right way, right? As opposed to the old ways of thinking, right? So just to conclude, in the day-to-day, my friends, Romans 12 is a good paradigm for us, right? We have to not conform to the way that this world thinks, right? Like Isaiah 55, we have to think Yahweh's thoughts. Instead, we have to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And notice that it takes a renewing of our minds. And we're not talking about anything mystical here, right? We're talking about changing our thinking in accordance with the word of Yahweh, allowing the word of Yahweh to transform our thinking so that we no longer are thinking along with the crowd, right? So hopefully this gives you some food for thought, no pun intended. Let's bow for word of prayer. Heavenly Father Yahweh, we give you thanks for your word, and we pray that you help us each day, Father, to make a decision every day to transform our thinking, Father, to renew our minds and to think thoughts more like you, so that we can put your things above our own, Father, that we can deny ourselves and instead put to death those things that are contrary to your word, Father, and instead uplift those things that are in line with your ways of thinking, Father Yahweh. Help us to love you, and even if we appear different to the world, Father Yahweh, may they see that difference in a positive way, Father Yahweh. May they see that we think differently because we have a higher standard, Father Yahweh. We have high standards for ourselves that are grounded in your word. Not high-minded, Father, but high standards that are grounded in the sound principles of Scripture. And as we come in contact with people, may we with humility show them how we live, Father Yahweh, how we think, the basis of our faith and the basis of our lives and the way that we operate in our lives, Father. May they see that it comes from thoughts that are pure and noble and just and right and admirable and good, Father Yahweh. Because we have the mind of Messiah, and that's the way he was. And we want to be like him. We want to be like our master. So we thank you for everyone who's here, Father. And we ask that you be with us in the remainder of the Sabbath, that we can rejoice in one another's company and in your presence. And then we pray, Father, that you bless us in the coming week so that we may be able to be successful and achieve the things that you have for us in our lives. And whatever we go through, Father, may we use those challenges to persevere and to become better and to become stronger, Father, that we can honor you in all that we do, and that the kind of people that we become, Father, will be people that are strong, that stand upright, and firm in your word and your truth. In Yahshua's name, we thank you and we commend ourselves into your hands. Hallelujah. Okay, my friends, before I close, are there any questions? Thank you. Okay, let me stop the recording.